So hello everyone, my name is Christian and I'm a member of the admissions team at Schwarzman Scholars, and it's a pleasure to connect with you on this really exciting topic. Today I'm joined by a really rock star panel of Schwarzman Scholars alumni who will share their experiences and their closeness to the topic of leadership. But before we get started, I wanted to remind for those who are joining us, we host a speaker spotlight series on different aspects of the Schwarzman Scholars program. So while we won't get to talk specifically about some of the program offerings, we do have a variety of different resources that you can find on our website, as well as webinars on our YouTube channel and a lot of social media. So I do encourage you to learn more about the program and what the architecture of it looks like in terms of the master's degree in global affairs, as well as some of the other program offerings outside of the webinar. But for today's conversation, we're going to squarely focus on this discussion about leadership. We're going to be able to share out this conversation, running it through some of the different experiences of the scholars in their application process, and we'll talk more specifically about that. So before we get started, I want to do a full round of introductions by those scholar alum who are on the call for today, and we'll start off with Stacey Ann, and then we'll go from there. So go ahead and give your intro, what you're doing, what you're up to, and how life is.
Sure. All right. Thanks, Christian. Hi, everyone. So my name is Stacey Ann Pearson. I'm originally from Jamaica. I was part of the second cohort, so that's 2017 to 2018 as a scholar. And then I also served as a senior scholar. It's sort of a mentor in the third cohort class. So after Schwarzman, I decided to stay in China and work in the high-tech scene in China, and I'm now currently serving as the head of international business development of a small JV between Oxford University and the Hainan government, focused on blockchain research and how it can be applied to real-day use cases. So I'll pause there and pass it on.
Terrific. Danielle.
Hey everyone, I'm Danielle Nabor. I am a scholar from the second cohort, the same cohort as Stacey Ann, and I'm from the United States, where I currently am based. I live in Washington, D.C. and work for the U.S. Department of State, where I work on issues, specifically transboundary water and river governance issues, as well as other environmental issues, including wildlife trafficking and biodiversity. Right before that, right after Schwarzman Scholars, I spent a year as a fellow at the Wilson Center through a program that Schwarzman Scholars funds called the Schwarzman Fellowship, where I was able to continue doing research on water based in China. That's it for me. Thanks.
Terrific. Tanae.
Hey everyone, my name is Tinae. I'm a scholar from the third cohort, and currently I'm a product manager working at Google. I work within the fintech space, so trying to help Google understand the set of problems that everyday Americans face when it comes to their finances, and thinking about building products that we can use to improve those people's lives.
Thanks, Tanae. And from our most recently graduated class, Kai.
Yeah, thanks. So my name's Kai. I am originally from New York City, but am currently in Jamaica, where my family's from. And I went to Williams College and studied economics before graduating and doing the Schwarzman Scholars program. I
think we might have lost your feed there, Kai. So yeah, so it is a pleasure again to have a conversation about leadership, and we'll definitely bring Kai back in as soon as he gets reconnected. But just as a kind of foundational start, Schwarzman Scholars are great storytellers, and I think that's something that is a key aspect. Oh, Kai, I see that you've rejoined, so maybe finding a good Wi-Fi spot, but we'll loop you back into a conversation. But Schwarzman Scholars are really good storytellers, and the application process in and of itself is an exercise in simplification of understanding what are the different variants and experiences in your life, and how do you tell a compelling story. And so our conversation today will be exploring all those different pieces about how do you navigate who you are, the challenges that you've overcome, those inflection points that you've had to go through to really crystallize some kind of understanding, and then the reflection of having some kind of transformative new worldview to be able to implement to whatever it is that you're looking to change and drive. So I asked the scholars to kind of come up with a few of their remarks when they reflected on their leadership stories. So we'll start off with Stacey Ann to kind of give a general overview about how she approached something like articulating your leadership in the application process. So go ahead, Stacey Ann.
Sure thing, and I'll keep it really brief. So one thing that was really important for me throughout my process was deep reflection. So my actual first touch point with Schwarzman was when I was about to graduate from Lafayette College. I studied engineering, and my scholarship director reached out to me and said, hey, there's this really great program. It's called Schwarzman Scholars. At that point, I did a small evaluation about where I was in my career, what I wanted to do, and how Schwarzman could affect my career at that point, and made the decision actually not to apply upon right before I graduated, simply because it didn't make sense for where I was in my career at that time. Fast forward a year and a half later, when I was going through a professional pivot, trying to figure out what I wanted to do. So after I graduated, I went into investment banking at Morgan Stanley, New York. And 1.5 years into that, I went through this pivot period where I was thinking about what's my next step, and looking at what's the present scale on the global impact, and how I could connect that with Jamaica and what I was interested in, which was strategy and finance, and how the financial system affects the world, and specifically my home country. So after going through that, I re-looked at what were some of my options, and Schwarzman came up again. And I looked into the program, looked into the webinars and interviews that were available, and just knew that this was something that could add complete value to where I wanted to be for myself, and something that I could add value. And so that was the second point, actually. So a year and a half after I graduated. After going through that, it followed maybe a couple weeks of really this process of reflection, writing things down about what I wanted to accomplish and how Schwarzman would fit into that, and how Schwarzman in China would fit into that. Bouncing it off from my mentors and close family and friends, and then redefining what that was based on my biggest dreams, biggest goals, and boldest aspirations. And that at that point, when I realized that, okay, there is a symbiotic relationship between what I could provide to the cohort that I was applying to and what Schwarzman could provide to me, that's when I decided, okay, this is something that I want to apply to. So for me, throughout the entire process, it was really about reflection, being truthfully, brutally honest with myself about what it was that I wanted to accomplish and how Schwarzman would play that role. And the first part, right, was determining that actually this is not right for me right now. And then after a certain period, right, when the time was right, when I could properly say, yes, I can write a compelling argument as to how Schwarzman will fit into my career, that's when I made the decision to apply. So that would be sort of the overarching aspect of, what underpinned my application process, with this deep sense of reflection, truthful reflection. Otherwise, I sort of spent the entire time really getting feedback, right, from not just myself, but from my external partners, that would be able to say, hey, yes, that makes sense in terms of your personality and what you want to accomplish. And this would make sense to a committee that actually doesn't know you face to face, but can get a sense of you based on your stories. And so that's the process through which I went through the application. This sort of reflection, deep internal reflection, and then this sort of relationship where I was gathering feedback, not just from myself, but people that I trusted.
Thank you so much, Stacey Ann, and that's a great kind of bird's eye view on that process, that it is about that lesson of distillation and how to run that through as many people as possible, because we are the worst at telling our own stories, right? So Danielle, I'd love to have you reflect on a little bit about your leadership narrative and what you brought into the space of that application.
Sure. I'll start with kind of what Stacey Ann did and give a slight a bit of background on how I approached the application and where in my life I was when I decided to apply, which is that I was finishing up undergrad, and I was actually taking a leadership course that was taught by my university's former chancellor. I attended the University of Arkansas. And it was actually a conversation with him that led me to really think about applying. I had been working in the space of water access and environmental engineering. I too studied civil engineering like Stacey Ann, and was really interested in ways that I could continue that work, and had become very interested in Chinese water management after studying abroad in the Mekong Delta and learning about the ways that China affects the world's rivers. And so I had this like subject matter interest in water, had this subject matter interest in how China might affect that. But it was really this leadership aspect that I was very skeptical of, and wasn't really sure how I might be a leader and what being a leader in that very niche topic that I was really interested in might look like. And through conversations with my professor, I had a lot of conversations about this idea of like leadership in this industrial complex, like very like monetized way that we see like all over Instagram is not really what I was drawn to. And it turns out that, and that isn't what I tried to depict in my application. I think that's not really what the application is asking for. It's more of this idea of like, what do you care about, and how have you mobilized people and yourself to address those issues, and how do you want to continue doing that in the future, and what do you need to make that possible? And so that's kind of what I wrote about in my narrative, was an experience I had while an intern in Ecuador, working on clean water access, and how through the engineering design process, and then sharing that engineering design process through a group of people, and enabling a community to increase their own access to water, how that might be actually leadership, when before I was like, this is an engineering problem, this isn't leadership. So kind of thinking out of the box is like, leadership is not having a degree from a fancy university necessarily. Leadership is not being president of that university or having this like very clear-cut version of what a leader might be, but it actually can be something much more tangible, and in that way feels more legitimate. So I guess I'm still not entirely sure what leadership actually is, but I think that I would suggest people approach their narrative by thinking about what you really care about, thinking about how you have mobilized a group of people to address that, how you've mobilized yourself to address that, and how the program, the Schwarzman Scholars program, will help you do that more effectively in the future. I'll stop there.
Yeah, no, I thank you again for that reflection. Leadership means everything and nothing at the same time. And I think that's something that the Schwarzman Scholars program, you get into that sandbox and you deconstruct what leadership is. And then you think about what are the influences that range from where you studied, where you came from, what your parents did. So all these different things kind of help shape what is that leadership narrative. So it's really acting leadership as a verb, as a behavior in what you do, rather than a concept that you're just kind of working on. Today I'm going to turn it over to you to do a reflection on what you talked about in your leadership essay, and how you crafted that conversation in the application process.
Sure. So I'm trying to think back, man, it's been a couple of years. So I heard about Schwarzman Scholars actually while living in Singapore. I was doing a rotation with LinkedIn where I was working at the time. And living in Southeast Asia for the first time in my life, it was pretty clear that the only thing that people talked about in terms of politics and economics, the top of the list was always China. And I knew nothing about China. I had never been there. I didn't speak the language. But I really wanted to learn more. And that's kind of when I started doing a bunch of internet research, talking to friends, and that's how I found out about Schwarzman. So I guess to your question about what I wrote about in my leadership narrative, for me, I wanted to try and show a consistent set of leadership experiences that started in college and then continued in the workplace. And so I believe the way I structured my essay was I tried to come up with a few unifying leadership related themes, like for example, leading project teams through complicated questions. And I started with my essay, the first half being more about college, talking about a club that I spent a lot of my time with and kind of the way that I had structured it, some of the problems that we were solving. And then I continued that narrative through during my time at LinkedIn, where I talked about some problems that I had worked with on really kind of cross-functional organizations, long-term projects that took like months, if not years to complete. and try to show a sense of consistency. And I think in retrospect, like I would definitely emphasize that consistency point, which is consistency doesn't mean that you've always known what you're doing. That's not what consistency is. Consistency means that you've always been thoughtful about your role as a leader, and you've always tried to strive and find positions where you could have an impact. And regardless of different situations, whether it was different living in different countries or working for vastly different organizations, maybe it was like something in one subject area or the other, show the admissions committee that you have consistently thought about how you can work on those same leadership principles in very different situations.
Yeah, absolutely. The conversation is a lot of how do you not just espouse the values, but how do you enact them? And that's really important for us to be able to see the kind of you putting in the work, you constantly growing, but your intrinsic motivation really being connected to how to make systems better, how to make people better. Kai, I'm going to also bring you in for your quick download on your leadership narrative in the application process, and then we'll have a general discussion about some probing questions to help our viewees today. So go ahead, Kai.
Yeah, thank you. And apologies for the Wi-Fi snafu. It was working fine just before the call and then started to bug out. But I think actually my reflections would be a combination of all the answers that have been said so far. So maybe I'll start off with Stacey Ann's point on reflection. The first time I found out about the Schwarzman Scholars program was when actually someone from the admissions team came to Williams, and I just happened to be the student that signed up for just about anything that came across announcements. So when they said that there was going to be free food, I signed up and went. And I sat down and I started to listen to this offering that you'd be in a cohort of hundreds of people from all across the world living in China. And, you know, as they went on, by the end of the session, I was absolutely convinced that this was something that I needed to do. The question of when I needed to do it was not quite clear to me at the time, but I knew that I wanted to do it. And so in the subsequent years, I was leading up for 2 years after, that was my sophomore year of college. For the 2 years afterwards, I consistently journal. So every single day I reserved a space in my journal to talk about what I might want to tell the Schwarzman Scholars Committee if I were to apply to the program. And so when it came time to actually write my leadership narrative, it was a collection of reflections on things that I was doing anyway. It wasn't like a conjuring up of experiences that I thought might be appropriate for the application. It was in every sense, my pure reflections on everything that I was doing for the communities that I was involved in. So I think reflection, I would highly emphasize that as well, as like incredibly important, because not only does it help you to really solidify your narrative, it also helps you to write it as well. If you can codify it in the months and the weeks leading up to when you actually apply, and you don't have to sit there and try and brain dump and write it all in one sitting. The next thing I'd say would be this idea of emerging leadership, which I think Danielle talked about, which is, you know, here's a problem that exists within a community that you're proximate to. What is it that you can do to solve that problem, and what needs to be done to solve that problem? So a lot of the leadership experiences, and I want to emphasize this too, that I talked about might not necessarily have been me solving the problem, but rather me identifying that a problem needed to be solved and finding the people that I could bring together to solve that problem. And so a lot of what I talked about in my leadership essay was an organization that I started, which was an umbrella organization at my college that helped students with career readiness programs, because I noticed that a lot of, you know, people say the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed. And I think the same for most opportunities, it sort of lives in silos. And so I wanted to consolidate all the information, make it accessible to students. But I myself am not a domain expert on every. I went and coordinated and collaborated with all the student leaders who I knew could be helpful in that endeavor, and connected them to each other to then help the students themselves, which was the sort of the central thing that I talked about in my application, because fundamentally I thought that the Schwarzman Scholars program was about coordinating and collaborating across different beliefs, across different domains, across different ranges of expertise. And so demonstrating that I could do that, I thought would be incredibly important. And then finally, I think maybe the most important thing that I kept in mind is that everyone gets into the program for different reasons, but I think everyone gets rejected from the program for the same reason. And the reason that I say that is that I think that you have to be completely unapologetically yourself, and in that way differentiating yourself from every other applicant. And so going back to this point of reflection, you have to sort of shift from what do you think they want to hear to what is it that you can say that no one else can, and lean into the aspects of your life that are distinctly you and uniquely you, because only you can tell your story. And how I tangibly did that was that I started with the takeaway point at the top of my leadership essay, like, what do I want you to know about me? And broke every subsection by paragraph with topic sentences that really described who I am as a person. So if you only read the first sentence of every paragraph, you would walk away with a clear understanding of who I was. And it was all experiences, although seemingly disparate across countries, across professional or personal, but all places where I exhibited leadership that went along the silver lining. So this goes to Tane's point about consolidation. I called it sort of a silver lining, like what is the connective theme between your disparate experiences that bring them all together, not only in the past and the present, but certainly how will Schwarzman as an input to that function contribute to the, achievement of something greater for not just yourself, but the world as well. And I think maybe the last point I'll say is that, you can lead by stepping up, but you can also lead by stepping back. And I tried to mention that as well.
Well, thank you so much for that consolidation of all the different narratives. And I think that, I just sit here with goosebumps on, because I think that it's that collaborative aspect, that leadership as a collaborative practice that I think is really, really interesting. So in advance of this conversation, I had a conversation with another scholar who is in our current class of Schwarzman Scholars, who is a movie documentarian. And I asked him, what is Christopher Carpenter is his name, so shout out to Christopher. What are the different pieces of good storytelling? And he really kind of talked about this hero-heroine's journey of thinking about the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and catharsis, about thinking about where am I building tension within the application that compels the admissions persons or the selectors to really believe in my narrative. And so he said, one of the statements that he made clear to me is that authenticity drives good writing. So when it comes to creating your leadership narrative, it has to come from a place that is authentic. And so I want to turn this back over to our panelists to kind of reflect a little bit about where was it in your understanding of leadership was the inflection point, was the time where you're face down in the arena, you had the option to give up or U-turn, but you kept on going, and really reflecting on that adaptation to those challenges that you've seen. And we'll start off with Danielle, and then we'll kind of do another round robin of different things.
I think when I think about the multiple inflection points in my life that I've had in terms of this, my viewpoint or the view of myself in terms of what I'm able to do and what I might offer other people through my career, through who I am as a person, through my journey, including my time in China at Schwarzman. I think it's been this big process of learning, I have less to offer in the concrete sense that I think I can do, this idea of I am a leader and I can do all of these things to help you. And this idea of I have so much to learn and grow. And through that process, I actually am able to make a difference. And so this idea of turning, specifically in my field, water access and clean water, it's all about number of people you can help. So looking at for development outcomes, how many people can we increase access to clean water? How many people can we change, the amount of water and in their home, the taps and toilets, that sort of narrative. And I think that for a long time, I constantly felt like I wasn't enough of a leader. I wasn't enough of this person who could make enough of a difference, because there's no way for a single person to affect millions of lives in the way that I had initially wanted to at 18 or 19 when I first got really interested into this subject matter. And I think that kind of going through that, the number of times that I was face down, realizing that I just couldn't do that was I think really impactful, and instead allowed me to have some, grace for myself as a person, and that all we can really do is try to be good at our subject matter and try to help people along the way. And if that's increasing clean water, great. If that's just my coworker is having a bad day and I can help out and pick up one extra task at work, that's also valuable in a way that I think I didn't see before. And I think that this the inflection point maybe is that this, like these large outcomes, this like broad swath of changing the world, I think has kind of shifted through all of those times that I wasn't able to achieve the outcomes that I wanted, or realize that it's just not possible to do these types of things by myself. I think that has really changed the way I view myself as a leader and a person who can make a difference in the world.
Right, and we say in the admissions office that leadership comes from a place of growth and vulnerability and failure. So if you're not able to showcase that stuff in some way in your narrative, then we miss the mark. There's a lot that people apply with the mindset of, let me throw everything that I've achieved at the admissions team, without understanding, like they're asking what is most important. And that's the conversation about what is the problem that you're bothered by, and where do you demonstrate that you've done the work to do that. Today, I'm going to have you come in as well to kind of think about what were those issues that you were bothered by that you shared in your application narrative, and how did you convert that anguish into action that was compelling for the admissions committee to take you in?
Yeah. So I think for me, the issues that I talked a lot about in my application and then subsequently in my interview were ones that centered all around the field of tech policy. And what was frustrating for me is, as someone who was working at the time in the tech sector and also had this massive interest in policy, the amount of butting heads that we saw between those two industries and sectors was extremely frustrating. I think I had applied around the time when there was kind of the major first tech backlash that was coming out around data privacy, misinformation, et cetera. And for me, I just wanted to understand, how do we bring these two worlds together, right? In a way where there's a mission on both sides, and it's actually much more aligned than most people think. Approaches are different, and like the people are different, but how do you actually bridge some of those gaps? And for me, I wanted a year to really take some time to understand how those two sectors could come together. And I also wanted to study a parallel example in China, right, where the relationship between tech and policy is extremely different than it is in the US, and understand the pros and cons of that as well. And I guess in terms of how you turn that anguish into something more productive in your essays, I think this is really where showing, I guess, your range of intellectual curiosity is super, super important. And by the way, I think that's a big part of being a leader as well. The ability to kind of like have your interest piqued by a variety of topics, know like how deeply to go into one versus the other. And then once you go deeply into a topic, to like turn that knowledge into action is like a very specific skill set that I'm sure a lot of you have done in classes or even at work. And so ask yourself, like, how do I take a topic that I'm really interested about and then demonstrate that I have an approach when it comes to like gaining more knowledge and turning that knowledge into action, and then like kind of tell that story throughout your essay. And so for me, I talked a lot about both the work I had done in the tech sector as well as work that I had done in the policy world, and then kind of use that to try and assert that, hey, if I got into this scholarship, here's what I would do next. Like, here's what I've done before, and now project that forward, and hopefully that'll have some sort of impact.
Incredible. So I want to pivot our conversation from the philosophical discussion of leadership and what it means for us individually, and converting that into, how did I put that into the application? And for those who are viewing, we recommend that you look at the entire application, not just your essays as the leadership narrative, but asking the question, what is my leadership narrative in each of the individual pieces? And that's where I think something like an intersectional identity of like where you're coming from, where you studied, what you do, what your passions are, can show up in bursts from your video to your short answer to the letters of recommendation. So I want to ask Stacey Ann about this process of trying to simplify all those data points of your life into a leadership narrative, into the application. So what are some tips with that call to action?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first aspect, or the first thing that I really did, was to really study, what the program was looking for, and compare that with different aspects of my life that I could offer. First, to ensure that it matched, right? That this was the right program for me. And secondly, to create sort of a roadmap or a puzzle, right? So where I have all the pieces together, so that I could create a larger map for myself and see which aspects I wanted to highlight through my essay, which aspects I wanted to highlight through my recommenders, which aspects I wanted to highlight, through the other means that you already mentioned. So actually, I wanted to reiterate something you said, which was I really didn't throw everything into my leadership essay, right? So there were different aspects of my leadership that I wanted to highlight specifically in the essay, but there were also other aspects that I wanted to highlight through my letters of recommendation that tied into things that I was passionate about, or something related to the work that I wanted to eventually do between China and Jamaica. So for example, in my leadership essay, I wanted to focus on my strategic skills and problem solving skills. And so I focused specifically on one instance at undergraduate where I created this organization for students who were not being properly supported by the school. And the difficulties that I faced in creating that organization and how I overcame that. So that was really that core of my leadership essay. But there are also other aspects of my identity and also my leadership that I wanted to bring out in the application. And so there is another aspect from one of my recommenders. He was one of my mentors. I worked with him as a board director on a nonprofit in New York, and his working with him, his focus for my recommendation, I wanted that to be around bringing in new ideas really as a young leader, so that I was the youngest board member for that organization. So being able to take mentorship, being able to learn on the job, and being able to lead even in a space where I would be the youngest voice, or should be expected to act in a different way, right? So that was another aspect. And then other parts of my personality, right? I tried to infuse throughout the application. So it really wasn't about trying to, I saw there was a question about, do you do 2 to 3 examples for your leadership essay? I don't know what's the current running recommendation that the admissions team is giving, but personally, I think that if you can create this big map, right, for yourself of things that you want to communicate to the committee, and tease out each different aspect so that each aspect gets its own, right, its own 100% capacity, right? The focus of the committee on that aspect in each, let's say, subsection of the application. I think that's much more powerful than trying to fit in multiple different examples within one subsection of the essay. So that would be my recommendation. So really build your map first to really understand what is it that you're trying to communicate. And then you can sort of tease out to different parts of the application through the recommendation, through your essay, through your personal statement, what it is that you want to communicate to the committee.
Thank you for that, Stacey, because I think when candidates put too much, then it starts to crowd out all the different elements and how special and unique those different aspects are. Kai, I'm also going to flip the same question to you before we pivot to another point in the conversation about how did you go about using or simplifying the 600 hours of footage into a 60-minute episode for the admissions committee to engage with?
Yeah, thank you. Yes, so as I said, I started off really just journaling about what I might write about. But I'd say when I got into the actual writing process, the first thing is that I reframed my thinking to think more about the fact that I had nothing to lose and everything to gain in writing my application. And sorry if there's background noise. And I wrote as though I was already in the program, because I think that if it doesn't make sense to you, it probably won't make sense for anyone else. And so the way that I sort of thought about it was that the admissions team had already accepted me into the program, and my writing was actually a reason that they might reject me if it didn't make sense. So that was the way that I sort of framed my thinking as I was writing, I think would be an important first primer. The second thing is that I think my sort of inflection point, if you will, perhaps going back to one of the questions we had before, was that I think when people approach the application, they oftentimes think, you know, I need to have cured cancer and I need to have, you know, been president of this small country and did all this stuff. But actually, what I think you have to do is just sell the admissions committee a pencil. Is sort of the way that I thought about it, was that you're not trying to pretend to be anyone that you're not, and you're not trying to throw all these extravagant sort of large accomplishments into your application. What you're trying to do is communicate a simple idea, and a simple idea that is authentic to Christian's point. So then the next thing I'd say is that simple ideas get communicated and complex ones get ignored. And so in the actual process of writing down what you want people to take away first, I think is the best way to structure your writing. And so that's what I did for every single section. I just wrote down my big idea for the entire application. Like, here's the overarching narrative that I'm trying to convey. And then within that, I think about it more as an investment case. You know, you can then collect the different experiences, reflections that you have to justify that larger vision that you have for yourself. And the reason why I think this is important is because you just want to be clear, I think. And I talked before about putting it into subsections as well, but for the overall application, I think of, for instance, if you think about the overall application as one essay, then there are different aspects of that essay that need to be cohesive and clear from start to finish. And you're not necessarily trying to write something that says, hey, this is why, or solely, hey, this is why I'd be good for the program. But I was fundamentally structuring as, hey, this is why I'm good for the world. And so Schwarzman Scholars then became an integral part of that application. And instead of it being like Schwarzman is the end all be all, it was Schwarzman is an integral part of this journey that I'm on. And Schwarzman, if you'd like to be involved in this rocket ship of a trajectory that I've set for myself, I would welcome your participation. But if, you know, if not, then that's cool. So I think it was just kind of that reframing, like, how do you fit this experience in? And then more tangibly, I think if you spread out your writing, it's usually easier to communicate and to organize. So it's back to the point of like spreading out your writing over time. And then the final thing on recommendations, I chose people who had like fun experiences with me, not necessarily leadership experiences with me, because again, I was thinking about differentiation. And so if your recommenders can speak to times where you both exhibited leadership, but were also just a really great person to be around, or an interesting person or a creative person, I think that that'll distinguish you from a lot of other people where recommendations usually follow the same template. They have this major accomplishment and this is why this is important. I highly recommend this person. But if you get a recommendation that says, this is like the most fun person to be around for these XYZ reasons, they can talk to leadership as well. But again, just thinking about the different components of your applications, like what do you want the only part of your application that's given to other people to say about you? It shouldn't just say the same things that you would say about yourself. And certainly there should be some overlap. It's certainly a Venn diagram. But what other distinctive aspects of your life and experience do you want them to tease out? And that was sort of the way that I thought about recommendations. And that doesn't have to be left to chance either. You can give them guidance. And that's not like give them your essay and have them write, you know, like the same thing virtually. It's here's what I'm thinking. And here are some experiences that we've had together before they write the recommendation. And then you'll kind of have a rough sense in a suggestive fashion what they might write about. So I think that that was sort of keeping everything in full picture and looking at it more as like, what can I offer to the Schwarzman Scholars Program? And also what can the Schwarzman Scholars Program offer to me as well?
Thanks so much for that, Kai. There's this paradox within the admissions process where we have some candidates who say a lot of nothing, and you have candidates who say everything with very little. And I think that's this whole process of trying to understand what do I prioritize in finding that balance. A phrase that we like also is going from grandeur to granular. So how can you come in to zoom in on a very specific instance that then is embodying of who you are as a person? And so that whole process of navigating that leadership piece it's self-excavation. You splatter everything out onto a page and you start to pick out and extract what are the pieces that are really going to embody me. So as we pivot now the conversation, because again, it's about articulating your leadership narrative, I want to zoom in on the exercise of meeting a leadership narrative in a fellow scholar that might have changed like your worldview and the way that you think about leadership. And so I asked in advance of our chat today for the scholars to reflect on someone who they've met, a fellow peer, a fellow scholar, who's kind of changed their viewpoint, disrupted their set of assumptions, but did so by, in which way did they kind of get that sense? So I'll start off with Tanae about identifying someone whose perspective kind of changed the way that you saw the world, and then we'll flip it over to Danielle right after that.
Sure, yeah, so I think one scholar who ended up being one of my closest friends throughout the entire year, he was a journalist who was really interested in a lot of the same topics that I was from like a tech policy angle. And he had spent the 5 years before Schwarzman traveling through a bunch of countries, probably like 7 or 8 different countries, and living in them as well, reporting on issues relating to things like censorship and surveillance, persecution of ethnic minorities, et cetera. And I think that spending time with him, really changed my perspective in terms of like what it takes to really deeply understand an issue and to make an impact. Because here was someone that was not afraid to spend years of their life, living in very uncertain very uncertain conditions, not always comfortable conditions, but because it was a topic they loved and because they were doing really impactful work that was helping kind of deepen people's knowledge within this space. And so thinking about like the sorts of leadership positions that I'm sure are in his future, they'll kind of be rooted in the fact that he wasn't afraid to take a risk and try something pretty crazy, in his 20s. And I'm sure the knowledge he's kind of amassed from this, I already saw how much he was able to bring forth into Schwarzman. And then now actually in terms of some of his work afterwards from a research perspective has also been super exciting, and he's starting to really get a lot of traction. So just that perspective of knowing like, it's okay to take a massive, massive risk that no one else that like in your peer group is doing, because it's all centered around you doing something that you really enjoy on a problem that's really impactful for the world. So yeah, I really appreciated that.
Terrific. And Danielle, same question.
There's so many good examples. And I think I really like I forget who said it, but this idea of like, everyone got into Schwarzman for different reasons. And I think that is really reflected in like the vast difference of ways that people approach the program, the ways that people have benefited from the program. But one specific person that has really affected the way that I think about leadership is she has a lot of different interests and a lot of different talents. And I think that specifically she is both very, very creative. She's like a writer. She was involved in theater. She can sing. She sang at our talent show. And she also had a career in finance and is still working in the financial sector. And I think sometimes at Schwarzman and other similar programs, there's this idea of like, you have to pick a lane and like you have to do your, you have to either be the finance person or like the creative theater person. And I think it's been really, really cool to see the way that she has balanced all these aspects of her personality and her interests and has, invested in herself in all of those sectors. And I think that she's also been able to kind of weave it together in a narrative that looks back on the ways that her family and her relationships with her grandmother and people who are important to her have also colored that, and also her national identity and the ways that she wants to serve her home country through both the financial sector and then also creatively. So I think that weaving together of multiple interests, which I think can feel like it's impossible, has been really, really cool to watch her do successfully.
Terrific. Stacey Ann, is there someone who came to mind in listening to our reflection about other scholars?
Yeah, I mean, for me, right, so for myself, I'm a pretty stellar person in my ideas. And so coming into Schwarzman, right, Schwarzman Scholars, we love to discuss, we love to have all sorts of eye-opening experiences, even, if it's just over coffee. And so the first one was, I'm doing a little bit of a cheat, so it's 2, right? The first was someone who we really had just very opposite viewpoints about how to approach even how to approach discussions, right? Much less even very different, or much more very different viewpoints. From this interaction with the individual throughout the year, I began to adapt this idea of everyone has different viewpoints, that where they are is considered to be their truth. And in order to really be able to be a global leader, which is increasingly important these days, that has to be at the core of interactions. Sometimes there won't be a true objective truth that both or all parties will be able to come to an agreement on, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to disrupt or impede a path to a conclusion. So that was a really important one, especially I'm working in China, I'm working in the government and tech space. So that was a really big one for me to learn from. And then the second was a young woman. So she, her ability to bring diplomacy and pacificity to any discussion, no matter how enraging or how passionate or how just I don't want to say aggressive, but I'll go with passionate people get about topics, especially in our year. That was the year of the election and or the American election, sorry, and so a lot of tensions flared throughout the year. And her ability to really bring both sides of any discussion to a point where there could be calm and respectful understanding of each other's viewpoints was such a huge lesson in how to be a diplomatic leader, especially in these global times. So those are the two that I'd bring up.
Thanks so much. And I know that we're speeding closer and closer to the hour, so I just wanted to do a quick pause that in crafting this panel of scholars, I wanted viewers to get a sense of how differentiation and variance is so important, about how to define my definition of leadership, and then how do I defy it by showing the pieces of my portfolio that really show and speak to those values and my philosophy of leadership. So I think even just kind of summarizing what the conversation has been about today, there is that reflection, that timepiece about steeping into the thoughts and thinking, when is the best time for me to apply, and how does that come through conversation and dialogue through the different moments of your life, start to inform, now's the time, or now's the time to pause. And so that's such an important piece to kind of make sure that you're doing that reflection piece. And then also leadership being connected to China. And I think that's what makes Schwarzman different from other leadership programs, is that it is threaded through our leadership stance about, and that's what you heard from all the different scholars about how did they find in their ascendancy to leadership, China being a key piece into that. And so make sure that is also woven into your leadership narrative. As we start to close up shop, I'm going to ask the scholars to reflect on top tips about navigating this very complex process of leadership. And we'll go in reverse order. We'll start off with Kai, and then we'll work our way back through Stacey Ann. So Kai, go ahead and lead off with kind of closing thoughts and also tips for attendees in trying to navigate this very, again, very important conversation.
Yeah, I think maybe the biggest tip that I can provide is that leadership, I think, is sort of a personal, or I guess a better way to characterize it would be that it's an ongoing journey of self-inquiry. And so in that way, you shift in and out of positions of leadership every day in your life, is in the same way that you shift in and out of positions of privilege. And you can demonstrate leadership in just about anything that you do. But I think what's important is to record and to codify and to learn from that. And so in crafting your leadership narrative, just paying attention to those seemingly insignificant moments where people are showing kindness to someone, or when someone smiles at you, or things of that nature. And how can you take those sort of micro actions and reflect them on a larger scale in your leadership story, which I think was probably the most helpful for my leadership essay.
Terrific. Tanae.
Sorry, I'm still. Oh, sorry, you say Tanae or Stacy?
Today, go for it.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I think just in general, a couple quick tips. First off, as people said, be brutally honest with yourself. I think I started my application, worked on it for like a month, and then ripped it up and started over because I just didn't like it and the direction it was going. So don't be afraid to pivot. Don't be afraid to be bold, as long as it's kind of authentic to what your goals are and interests are. Um, the second thing is be really concise with your writing. I think that storytelling, sometimes people take to mean like writing long, like kind of novels about your experience. And the reality is that you want to be as punchy and concise as possible, and kind of make sure that people understand the main points of what you want to get across. And then the final tip is just think about how the people who write your recommendations can kind of round out your story. So maybe you won't have enough time or word count to tell your entire story with your own essays, and so maybe there are pieces of it, like maybe I don't know, your experience with complex problems, or your subject matter expertise, that you can kind of leave to your letters of your recommendation writers, and they can help round out your story and bring in a lot more credibility. And so, yeah, we just think about those three things, and best of luck.
Yeah, we're very much inspired by the Einstein quote, which is, if you can't tell your story simply enough, you don't understand it enough. And so it's really important to make sure that you're thinking about how do I tell this story in the most clear and digestible way. Before I flip it over to Danielle and Stacy Ann, I know that there are a lot of questions that we weren't able to get to. So this is a call to action that if you have a burning question, reach out to the admissions team. You can reach out at admissions@schwarzmanscholars.org. But Danielle, now that you've had a little bit of distance from the program, and your leadership most likely has been kind of changed and in a very transformative way, what are some tips that you'd offer, maybe even zeroing back on you before you applied, some tips for navigating this leadership conversation?
Absolutely. I want to touch back on something that Kai said that really, really helps me in my application process, which is this idea of the mind shift to think of it as a mutual fit. It's not necessarily only the sales pitch that you should go to Schwarzman. It's also this idea of it's actually your job to articulate who you are in the most accurate sense, and then see if it's the right fit. And that way, it also makes the rejection a lot easier. I applied to programs and got rejected from them. And it was like, well, it just wasn't a fit, because my job was to show who I am, what I want to do. And then if that's a fit, great. And if it's not, it just wouldn't be as beneficial to me to participate in the program anyway. So I think like that mindset shift kind of helped me articulate who I was in the application more appropriately, and also just have maybe a healthier mindset instead of trying to fashion myself to Schwarzman Scholars. Rather say, this is who I am. Let's see if it makes sense to both of us for me to participate. And in thinking of that, these questions of like, why me and why my past will make me a good member of this cohort. And I think considering what I can offer the cohort, what the cohort can offer me, in addition to the program itself and all the amazing things about being in China. And that being said, and what you said, Christian, about thinking about the way it's affected me with some years out, I had no idea how much I would still be working on China. I work on US-China issues every single day, and I have every day since I left Schwarzman Scholars. And so as you think about your narrative and you think about writing your application, also leave room for the program to change your trajectory. I actually had thought about doing a PhD program immediately after Schwarzman Scholars, and actually decided to turn it down because I didn't want to have a concrete path after the program. I wanted to give the program the room to change that path, and it really did. I didn't think I would be working on US-China relations this intensely, though I understood that China was going to be an important part of my narrative in the future. So I would consider that as you write your application, and think about the way that you would want to benefit from the program, because it really did change what I ended up doing. The last thing I want to say, and this was on my mind a lot as I was applying, and I almost didn't apply because I remember looking at the bios of the first cohort, and it was like almost all Ivy League institutions. And I say this, if you have attended an Ivy League institution, that is incredible. But if you haven't, like me, I attended the University of Arkansas, I immediately thought of myself as less qualified because I didn't have this banner on these bios, reading the scholars' bios that seemed so incredible, and I just couldn't hold a candle to those sorts of I don't know, accomplishments that other scholars had had. So my last piece of advice is have confidence in what you've achieved. And I think that Schwarzman Scholars benefits from people from all sorts of different backgrounds, different institutions, and different walks of life. And I think that don't let whatever research you've done on the cohorts that have existed, don't let that color whether or not you think you're qualified, because you probably are more qualified than you give yourself credit for. So I'll end with that.
Absolutely. Thanks so much. We're inspired by what is not on the website. So where are the leaders that are inhabiting spaces and places that aren't yet there? So I'll bring in Stacey Ann for her closing remarks, and then we'll end the show today.
Sure. So very quickly, the first part really is going off of what Danielle and Christian said. So it's really beyond what's on the website, right? It's about understanding what the Schwarzman Scholars program is trying to do as opposed to what they're looking for, right? So understanding what the program will help you to do as a tool. That for me was a really important aspect, because after understanding what the program would be able to do, then I could compare that with my own understanding of my biggest and boldest dreams for my career and for myself. And through the through the application process, I went through this reflection period where I challenged myself to think about what were some of just the absolute biggest dreams that I had. You know, what was the biggest impact that I think that I could have with my life? That was really a powerful moment for me personally as a reflection, regardless of Schwarzman. And then with the understanding of what the Schwarzman program was trying to do, I was able to find overlapping or symbiotic relationship between what the program was offering and what I wanted to do and how I could affect the program. So those were the two parts. The last part is really about, honestly, we all, might be planners and we all try to be high achievers, but in life, right, sometimes you just can't plan things, right? So as Danielle said, sometimes there are these moments where you have to go through this reflection period, but also think about fit. I think going through the process itself is really an amazing opportunity, because it allows you to go through this period of reflection. And so many of these questions I've seen, right, some of them are really about, oh, do you think, what do you think, right? It's not about what we think, it's about what you think and what's your, what you're trying to communicate as part of your narrative. So that would be the only part that I'd want to highlight, right? Truly understand what the program is offering, and then truly understand what you want to do with your life. And then remember that you really can't plan everything, and sometimes you do have to keep it open and move on to other opportunities that are out there.
Fantastic. And with that, a very sincere thanks to the scholars who were able to join me, as well as the viewers who are watching. I know there are a lot of burning questions we weren't able to get to, so please reach out, and good luck with crafting all of your leadership stories. We look forward to receiving your applications. Bye now.